The heat of the midday sun pressed down on the cul-de-sac, but the air was thick with something colder than weather. A mother's desperate footsteps pounded against wet pavement, each stride snapping against the echo of her own breath. Just ahead, Karen moved with stubborn determination, her short white hair stiff in the glare, a baby carrier gripped so tightly her knuckles blanched. The pale yellow blanket inside shifted with a small, fragile movement. The rattle tied to the handle trembled with every jolt, a tiny sound lost beneath the chaos of voices. Two HOA enforcers in navy polos stepped in front of the mother, their bodies forming a wall. One held out a folded citation as though a piece of paper could justify what everyone knew was wrong. On the porches around them, neighbors stood rooted, phones raised, unsure if they were witnessing law or theft. The man on the porch didn't move. He stood in the shade of his doorway, eyes locked on the carrier. His expression didn't change, but his hand curled slowly at his side, the muscles in his jaw working under calm skin. A single drop of rain from the morning storm slid down the edge of the no trespassing plate fixed to the doorframe, catching the sun before falling to the ground. Across the driveway, the mother's voice cracked under the weight of her own panic, every syllable fraying in heat. Karen avoided looking at her. She kept her eyes ahead, each step mechanical, as though she had already convinced herself she was doing the right thing. The SUV door was open. Sunlight flashed off the chrome trim, blinding for an instant. The carrier tilted toward the back seat. A neighbor's gasp cut through the air, sharp enough to make the man on the porch shift his weight forward. His eyes were unreadable, but there was a stillness about him that was heavier than any shout. The sound of the mother's hand slapping against the enforcer's chest rang out, raw and human. Somewhere down a block, a dog barked and went silent. Karen hesitated only once, a small pause that almost looked like a flinch. Then the carrier slid inside the SUV, the door closing with a muted thud. The engine hummed to life, a low vibration that seemed to spread through the pavement and into the bones of everyone watching. The mother broke free, lunging forward, her fingers brushing the rear window just as the SUV pulled away. Her reflection streaked across the glass, her own face looking back at her for a fraction of a second before the vehicle turned the corner. The cul-de-sac returned to its unnatural stillness, only the hum of distant traffic filling the silence. The man on the porch stepped down onto the driveway, slow and deliberate. His gaze followed the SUV until it was gone, then shifted to the mother, her breath ragged, her knees giving out onto the concrete. He crouched beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, not speaking. His presence alone was enough to still her trembling for a moment. Somewhere inside his chest, something cold and absolute took hold. He looked down the street where the SUV had vanished, his eyes narrowing just enough to sharpen the edges of his calm. Inside his mind, a door that had been closed for years swung open without a sound. And though no one else could see it yet, the air shifted around him. He stood again, stepping back toward the house, leaving the mother in the shade. The neighbors' murmurs started to rise, but they were only background noise now. He reached the doorway, pausing for a heartbeat, the sun flaring off the metal plate once more. Then, under his breath, so low only the walls heard it, he spoke words that carried the weight of a promise. Morning sunlight spilled across the backyard, warm and bright, but the air between the hedges was taut with unspoken tension. The man sat at a weathered wooden table, a mug of coffee cooling at his side, his gaze fixed not on the steaming liquid but on the sidewalk beyond. Karen walked past at her usual pace, clipboard in hand, her short white hair catching the light in fine silver threads. She stopped for a moment, pen poised above her paper, her eyes skimming over the yard as though measuring each blade of grass. The corner of her mouth tightened before she scribbled something down and continued without a word. The man didn't move, only watched her reflection fade from the polished surface of the coffee. The weeks before had been a steady climb in pressure, each day a new intrusion. A bright yellow violation notice slapped across his mailbox, the paper rippling in the afternoon breeze. Karen, arms crossed, speaking in low tones to two other board members while pointing toward his driveway. A fine notice folded neatly on the porch, its corners damp from morning dew, his hand folding it quietly and tucking it into his pocket without reading the rest. Neighbors had started keeping their distance, some avoiding eye contact entirely, others giving small nods that felt like silent apologies. The HOA's presence was no longer an administrative nuisance. It had become a constant shadow. Inside the house, the blinds were drawn just enough to let in a muted glow. He knelt by the bed, pulling a black case from beneath it. The latches clicked open, the sound sharp in the stillness. Inside lay a pair of tactical gloves, their leather worn smooth in places, a folded patch bearing the insignia of the Black Shield, and a single dog tag etched with numbers and a name that had once been called out in places far from here. His fingers traced over each item with the precision of someone handling more than objects, handling memories that never left. The gloves slid onto the bed beside him. Outside, the faint shape of Karen moved past the window again, her head turning just enough to glance toward the house. He closed the case, locking it with the same quiet deliberation as before, and slid it back into the shadows beneath the bed. The blinds shifted slightly, not from the wind, but from the subtle brush of someone passing too close outside. Rising to his feet, he crossed to the window, parting the slats with 2 fingers. Karen was there, standing by the hedge, eyes on something in her clipboard, her pen tapping against the paper. She looked up suddenly, and for a fraction of a second their eyes met through the narrow gap. No words passed, but the space between them was charged with something sharper than hostility. The day moved on, but the tension did not fade. In the afternoon, a notice appeared on the door, a list of alleged violations printed in precise black ink. The man read each line once, then folded the paper slowly and set it on the kitchen counter. His phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, the message short and unreadable to anyone else. Stand by. The sender's name was one he hadn't seen in years, one tied to nights without sleep and missions without headlines. He slid the phone into his pocket, stepped out into the fading light, and for the first time since the morning, the corners of his mouth shifted into the faintest trace of a smile. The kind of smile that only appears when something long awaited has finally begun. The afternoon sun burned sharp through the blinds, slicing the room into thin lines of gold and shadow. Karen sat in the corner of her living room, posture stiff, hands gripping her knees as if they might keep her steady. A thin bead of sweat traced down her temple, catching in the fine lines that framed her eyes. She wasn't used to being on this side of the conversation. The man stood in the doorway, not inside, not outside, but in that perfect space that said he could step forward at any moment. His hands rested in his pockets, but there was nothing casual about it. His gaze was steady, patient, and unblinking, the kind of look that felt like it could reach the truth without a single word. The silence stretched until it was heavy. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started, then stopped. Karen shifted, her foot tapping once against the rug before she caught herself. Her clipboard sat abandoned on the table beside her, papers half slid out, the edge of a cracked ceramic mug balanced against the stack. She finally spoke, voice low, but whatever she said made the faintest crease form between his brows. He stepped forward once, closing the space just enough that she leaned back slightly without realizing it. The tension didn't come from Ray's voices. It came from the way he listened, the way every second in his presence seemed like a test she didn't know the answers to. The light in the room flickered slightly as clouds passed over the sun, shadows shifting across the floor. Outside the window, 2 HOA board members stood on the sidewalk, their figures framed in the narrow slice of glass between the curtains. They were talking to each other, but their eyes kept flicking toward the house. One of them held a folder close to his chest. The other kept glancing at the street as if watching for someone else to arrive. Karen's breathing quickened almost imperceptibly. She tried to mask it with a cough, but the man caught it, his eyes narrowing just slightly. He didn't threaten her. He didn't need to. Each question he asked was simple, yet layered in a way that made her hesitate before answering. She shifted again in her chair, her fingers curling tightly around the armrest. Her voice faltered on one word, and for the briefest moment, she looked at the door as though calculating the steps it would take to leave. But she didn't move. She knew leaving wouldn't end this. Her eyes darted to the window again. The board members were gone. The man took a slow step back, his expression unreadable. The air seemed lighter without him so close, but it wasn't relief, it was the knowledge that the conversation wasn't over. He looked at the table, at the disorganized papers, at the list of violations in the middle of the stack. His gaze lingered for just a second before he turned toward the door. Karen didn't speak to stop him. She simply sat there, her breathing uneven, her hands gripping the chair until the veins stood out against her skin. He stepped into the daylight without looking back, his shadow stretching long across her porch before disappearing down the walkway. She stayed seated long after he was gone, staring at the doorway as if expecting him to step back inside at any moment. The wind had picked up by the time he reached the end of the block, carrying with it the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and the low hum of distant traffic. His boots pressed evenly against the concrete, each step deliberate, unhurried. Across the street, a row of neatly trimmed hedges hid the front yard of the community center, but he could see movement beyond them, shadows shifting, voices murmuring in short bursts. The gates to the building were closed, but the chain was loose, as though someone had meant to lock it and stopped halfway. He walked past without pausing, though his eyes swept over every detail. A black SUV sat parked at the curb 2 houses down, its windows tinted so dark that nothing inside was visible. It hadn't been there earlier. He noted the make, the plate, the subtle dent on the rear bumper before moving on. The road curved gently to the right, leading toward the eastern entrance of the neighborhood, where a tall brick wall marked the boundary. A single maintenance worker was there, leaning against a utility post, pretending to check his phone. The man didn't break his stride, but he caught the faint flicker of recognition in the worker's eyes. He turned down a narrower street, where the houses were closer together and the sidewalks narrower. A tricycle sat tipped over on a patch of grass, one wheel spinning lazily in the breeze. Curtains shifted in a nearby window. The stillness here was different, less casual, more deliberate. Every sound, every small movement seemed measured. At the corner, he stopped briefly, kneeling to adjust his bootlace, though his gaze was fixed on the reflection in a parked car's side mirror. 2 figures were approaching from behind, keeping a steady distance. He rose, brushed the dust from his hands, and continued. The figures slowed when he slowed, sped up when he sped up. They weren't neighbors out for a walk. Their steps were too uniform, their eyes too focused. He didn't look back. Instead, he turned into a driveway that led to an unmarked gate tucked between 2 houses. The lock was simple, but its presence told him enough. It wasn't meant to keep out everyone, just the curious. Inside the gate, the path wound between tall hedges until it opened into a small, unused courtyard. An old bench sat beneath a large oak, its surface worn smooth by time. He crossed to the far wall, pressing his palm against a brick that didn't quite match the others. It shifted slightly under his touch. Somewhere deep within the wall, a faint click echoed, almost masked by the rustle of leaves above. The air in the courtyard felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves held secrets. He stood still for a moment, listening. The 2 figures hadn't followed him in. They were gone, or they were waiting. It didn't matter. This wasn't the place for confrontation. This was a place for quiet moves, the kind that left no trace. As he stepped back through the gate, the street felt different. The SUV was gone. The maintenance worker had vanished. The tricycle was still tipped over, but the window curtain had stopped moving. He walked on, his eyes calm, his pace steady, but the air carried an unspoken promise. The next move would be his. The sun dipped lower, painting the street in muted gold as he turned toward the cul-de-sac where the Petersons lived. Their front porch light was already on, though the day still held enough light to see clearly. He approached casually, glancing at the houses on either side. The curtains here were open, but no one stood by the windows. It was the kind of quiet that didn't happen naturally. It was arranged. At the Petersons' driveway, a white van was parked, its engine off but its hood still warm. The side door was shut, no markings or company logos on its panels. He walked past it without pause, noting the faint scuff marks on the rear tires and the dust on the bumper. This vehicle had been parked in dirt recently, not just on clean suburban streets. The Petersons' front door opened before he reached it. Mrs. Peterson stood there, her face pale but steady, eyes darting toward the street behind him. She didn't say hello. She stepped aside, and he walked in, the faint smell of fresh coffee meeting him at the threshold. Inside, the living room was dim except for the warm glow of a single lamp in the corner. Mr. Peterson sat on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. "They were here," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "2 of them. Asked questions about you. About what you've been doing." He didn't answer immediately. He took a seat across from them, resting one arm on the chair. "Did you tell them anything?" "Of course not," Mr. Peterson said, shaking his head. "But they knew things. Things we never told anyone. About the storage lot. About the old shed behind the community center." Mrs. Peterson set a cup of coffee in front of him, her hands trembling just slightly. "They said you'd be dealt with soon." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavier than the silence that followed. He took a slow sip of coffee, his gaze steady on Mr. Peterson. "They won't deal with me. Not the way they think." A knock at the door made Mrs. Peterson flinch. He set the coffee cup down without a sound, his eyes shifting toward the hallway. "Go upstairs," he said to them quietly. "Stay away from the windows." The knock came again, 3 slow, deliberate raps. He rose and crossed the room, his footsteps measured. Without opening the door, he called out, "You're not welcome here." A voice answered from the other side, smooth and calm. "We're not here for you. We're here for the child." His jaw tightened, but his tone stayed even. "You're leaving. Now." There was a pause, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating. He waited a full minute before pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. 2 men in dark jackets were walking toward the van. One glanced back, their expression unreadable in the fading light. He let the curtain fall and turned back to the Petersons, who were peering nervously down the staircase. "They'll be back," he said simply. "But next time, I'll be ready." Outside, the van's engine roared to life, the sound lingering in the street long after the vehicle was gone. Inside, the air felt close, heavy with the quiet knowledge that the calm was temporary. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and stood. There was work to do. Night settled over the neighborhood with a deceptive stillness. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting pale pools of light onto the pavement. He moved along the sidewalk with deliberate steps, his eyes scanning the shadows between houses. Each sound, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of an air conditioner, registered in his mind, cataloged and dismissed. He had learned long ago that danger often announced itself in silence, not noise. At the corner, he stopped. Across the street, the community center loomed in darkness, its tall windows reflecting only the dim glow of the street lamps. A padlock hung from the front gate, but the chain was loose enough to suggest someone had tampered with it. He crouched low, running his fingers over the metal. Fresh scratches gleamed under the light. Whoever had been here was in a hurry. He slipped inside the gate, careful not to let the chain clink against the bars. The air smelled faintly of oil and damp wood, like the place had been closed for years. Moving past the main doors, he followed the narrow path to the side of the building, where an old shed sat under a leaning oak. The shed door was ajar. He pulled it open slowly. Inside, the darkness was thick, broken only by the narrow beam of his flashlight. Stacks of old folding chairs lined the walls. In the far corner, a tarp covered something bulky. He stepped closer, gripping the edge of the tarp, and pulled it back. Underneath was a stack of plastic storage bins, each marked with red tape. He opened one. Inside, files were packed tightly in neat rows, each folder stamped with dates going back years. Names, addresses, and photographs stared back at him from the first few pages. This wasn't ordinary record keeping. It was surveillance. He heard a faint crunch outside and froze. The light from his flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. Slowly, he set the bin lid back in place, pulling the tarp over the stack again. The crunch came again, closer now. He killed the light and stepped into the deepest shadow of the shed. Through the thin gap of the door, he saw movement, a figure approaching, their outline framed by the dim glow of the street lamp. The person moved with purpose, glancing around quickly before stepping toward the shed. He held his breath, feeling the old wood of the wall press against his back. The door creaked open wider. A faint smell of cigarettes drifted in before the figure stepped inside, muttering under their breath. They moved toward the tarp. He let them get within an arm's reach before stepping out of the shadows, his hand gripping the intruder's wrist. The figure jerked in surprise, but he moved fast, pushing them back against the wall. "Why are you here?" he demanded in a low voice. The intruder's eyes darted toward the tarp. "I needed the files," they whispered. "They've been watching all of us. They're not just after you." He studied them for a long moment, his grip firm. Then he let go, stepping back. "You shouldn't be here alone. Follow me." They left the shed quickly, locking the gate behind them. The air outside felt heavier, as though the night itself was closing in. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. He didn't look back. He knew the sound meant they weren't alone anymore. They disappeared into the shadows, the bins of files still hidden in the shed, waiting for the right time to be brought into the light. For now, the priority was survival. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. He moved quickly, keeping to the narrow side streets where the streetlights were fewer and the shadows deeper. The figure followed close behind, glancing over their shoulder every few steps as if expecting someone to emerge from the darkness. They reached the back of a small two-story building. It looked abandoned, with boards covering most of the windows and weeds creeping up the walls. He slipped a key from his pocket and unlocked a side door that blended into the wall's weathered surface. Inside, the air was stale and cool. The room was sparse: an old wooden table, two chairs, and a single lamp that he switched on, casting a dim yellow glow across the room. "Sit," he said quietly. The figure obeyed, pulling the chair closer to the table. He poured water from a jug into a glass and slid it across. "Start talking. What do you know about those files?" The figure hesitated, their fingers tightening around the glass. "It's bigger than you think. Those records, they've been tracking people for years. Not just residents here, but people from neighboring communities too. Every detail, where they go, who they speak to, even what they buy. It's all in there." His eyes narrowed. "Who's running it?" "That's the problem," the figure said, lowering their voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. "It's not just one person. It's a network. And they've got people in positions you wouldn't expect, inside the local council, the security company, even the mail service. They watch everything." He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the information pressing heavily on his thoughts. "Why take the risk to come here?" The figure looked down at their hands. "Because they're coming after you next. I overheard them talking. They think you know too much. And once they move, it's over." The rain began to patter lightly against the boarded windows. The sound filled the silence between them, each drop marking the passing of precious time. He stood, pacing slowly. "If they're watching everything, then we can't stay here. We need to get those files out before they realize we found them." The figure's eyes widened. "That means going back." "Yes," he said simply. "But this time we do it right. No noise, no mistakes." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded map, spreading it across the table. "Here's the layout of the community center. We enter through the north side fence, less patrols there. From the shed, we move the bins through the side alley and load them into a vehicle waiting here." He tapped a point on the map. "It's risky, but it's our best shot." The figures studied the map, nodding slowly. "And if they catch us?" He met their gaze without hesitation. "Then we make sure the files are destroyed before they can use them." The rain outside grew heavier, the wind rattling the boards over the windows. The figure took a deep breath, as if bracing for what lay ahead. "Tomorrow night," he said, folding the map and tucking it away. "Get some rest while you can. Once we start, there's no turning back." They sat in silence, the sound of the storm outside matching the quiet tension in the room. Neither spoke of the danger ahead, but both knew that when the time came, hesitation could mean the difference between exposing the truth or disappearing into the shadows forever. The warehouse door creaked open under the pressure of my shoulder, the sound swallowed by the hum of distant traffic. Inside, dust floated in the slanting daylight streaming through cracked windows. Old shelves and forgotten boxes lined the walls, but my eyes were fixed on the steel desk at the far end where the black briefcase sat, locked with a code pad. I stepped forward cautiously, every muscle tuned for movement. My partner kept watch at the entrance, his eyes scanning the street. The code pad blinked faintly, and I entered the sequence from memory, a set of numbers I'd seen on Karen's clipboard weeks earlier. The lock clicked open with a quiet satisfaction, revealing neatly stacked folders and a slim flash drive. My heart pounded as I realized this was every document they'd forged, every manipulation they'd hidden. Footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Karen's voice cut through the dusty air, sharp and frantic. "You don't belong here." She appeared in the doorway, her short white hair catching the light, face flushed with fury. Behind her, two HOA enforcers in uniform advanced, hand hovering near their radios. I straightened, the briefcase still open. "You've been using these families to pad your accounts," I said evenly. "And you took my child's safety into your hands without reason." Karen's glare wavered for just a moment. "It's the rules," she started, but I stepped forward, holding up the flash drive. "These are your rules? Altered reports, fake signatures, fabricated violations." My partner moved in sync with me, stepping to the side, subtly cutting off their escape. The two enforcers hesitated, glancing between us and Karen. The silence stretched before the first one spoke. "Is this true?" he asked her. Karen's jaw tightened, but her eyes gave her away. Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder. I'd sent the drive's contents to my contacts before stepping in here. Every file, every signature, every violation notice. The authorities had all they needed. Karen's composure finally broke. "You don't understand what they'll do to me," she whispered, her voice trembling. But I did understand. Accountability was overdue. Two officers entered the warehouse, taking control of the scene. Karen's protests dissolved into the metallic clink of cuffs. I picked up the briefcase and stepped into the sunlight, the air cooler than I expected. My child was safe, the truth was out, and the HOA's shadow had cracked wide open. As I walked away, I glanced back once to see Karen being led to a waiting car, her white hair stark against the dark seat. She met my eyes for the briefest moment, a mixture of regret, anger, and something that might have been relief, before the door closed. The weight on my chest finally lifted. This chapter was over. The neighborhood, the families, my family, we could breathe again. And though the work of rebuilding would take time, I knew one thing for certain. No one would ever use their power here to take what wasn't theirs again.